settle in and let your breathing slow, because tonight the mystery arrives softly, like rain tapping on airport glass. The air smells faintly of coffee, damp wool, and tired carpet shampoo, the kind of place where nobody looks too closely at anyone. You're sitting nearby when a calm, ordinary man buys a one-way ticket under the name Dan Cooper. He doesn't sparkle with danger. He blends in perfectly. And that's the problem. In this sleepy little corner of the world, one small note changes the temperature of the whole night. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the paper shift in a shaking hand. And the sleepless detective in you starts taking quiet, careful notes. You are in the right place for a story like this because nothing about it looks dramatic at first. It is a routine flight, a quick hop, the kind of trip that barely leaves a wrinkle in the day. And that ordinary choice is not an accident, it is the first piece of the plan. It is the evening of Wednesday, November 24th, 1971. Seattle is wet, like it often is, and the airport has that dim, indoor weather that makes time feel thick. In this era, before the strict identity checks you know today, you can become anonymous with a small effort, a paid ticket, a plain coat, a face that does not demand attention. You watch him move the way tired businessmen move, patient, slightly bored, conserving energy. He buys a one-way ticket to Portland, Oregon, on a Northwest Orient flight, a Boeing 727. He gives the name Dan Cooper. Later, the newspapers will turn him into D.B. Cooper because the world loves a mistake it can repeat. But right now, he is just a man in line, holding the future like it is a folded receipt. You notice little details because you are you. You notice the black tie, the white shirt, the calm, clipped manner, the fact that he is carrying a briefcase, not a duffel bag. It is the kind of luggage that says, "I belong here." The kind of luggage that says, "Do not ask questions," and the crowd helps him. Crowds always help. They blur edges. They excuse gaps. They make everyone feel like a harmless background character. Congratulations, you have just discovered why airports are useful to people who want to disappear. When he boards, it is not with a rush. It is with the slow certainty of someone who has already rehearsed the timing in his head. The plane is not full. There are around 36 passengers, give or take a few. The cabin air smells like warmed plastic, stale cigarettes, and the faint bite of jet fuel that always sneaks in. You take your seat in the story, not as a hero, not as a bystander, but as the quiet pair of eyes that actually remembers things. Because later, everyone will swear they remember, and most of them will be wrong. The flight takes off from Seattle-Tacoma. It climbs into a dark sky that looks heavy with low clouds. The kind of sky that swallows sound. Below, the city lights smear into watery lines. Up here, the cabin is a narrow tube of soft noise, engine hum, seat springs, small conversations that fade into nothing. And then comes that note. He calls a flight attendant over, a young woman named Florence Schaffner. He hands her a small slip of paper, like it is a phone number, like it is flirtation, like it is nothing. You have seen this move before in other cases, the way danger hides behind manners, the way a person offers you paper so you will lean in. The way control begins with a tiny, polite request. Florence, like many people in her position, does what people do when they are working. She glances at it. She assumes it is a passenger, trying to be clever. She does not read it right away. She tucks it into her pocket. That is the moment, the hinge, because he does not raise his voice. He does not threaten. He simply says, calm as a man ordering coffee, that she should read the note, that it is important. So she does. The words are plain, no poetry, no movie dialogue. He claims he has a bomb. He wants money, $200,000, and he wants parachutes, 4 of them, 2 primary parachutes and 2 reserve chutes. It is so specific it feels almost boring. That is part of the power. A wild demand would be easier to dismiss. This is practical. It is the kind of list someone makes when they have sat with the idea for a long time. Florence looks at him again. This time, she actually sees him. He opens his briefcase just enough for her to glimpse what looks like red cylinders and wires. Dynamite, maybe. Something made to resemble it, maybe. It does not matter. In that moment, your mind does not debate technicalities. Your mind does the simple math of survival. The crew does not scream. There is no stampede. There is only procedure, and that procedure is built from one cold truth. On an airplane, bravery is a luxury item. Quiet is safer than drama. Compliance buys time, so the cockpit is informed. The captain, William Scott, gets the message in the flat language of radio comm. There is a hijacker. He claims a bomb. He demands money and parachutes. And the aircraft keeps moving through the night as if nothing has changed. The passengers sit with their coats folded, their cigarettes, their small worries. Most of them do not know that the temperature of the flight has shifted by a few degrees. The subtle, invisible way fear enters a room. You watch the flight attendants. Their smiles hold, but their eyes do not. You notice the tiny things that happen when someone is trying to look normal. Hands too careful, movements too measured, a moment of staring at nothing. The hijacker, Cooper, sits in the rear of the cabin, seat 18E, or close to it, depending on the report you prefer. The exact seat becomes one more small argument in the long bureaucratic afterlife of this case, the kind of argument that will waste hours because investigations love details, even when details do not love them back. He asks for a bourbon and soda, and yes, they bring it. There is something quietly unsettling about that drink, not because alcohol is shocking, because it tells you something about his nervous system. He is not panicking. He is not sweating through his shirt. He is sitting there, drinking, like this is a dull business meeting that will be over soon. That is one reason this case refuses to die. The man does not behave like a desperate amateur. He behaves like someone who knows the shape of the room. Negotiations begin, and they are not cinematic. They are administrative. They are slow and careful and full of long pauses. Messages go from the cockpit to air traffic control, from air traffic control to law enforcement, from law enforcement back to the airline. Each step adds time. Each step adds the friction of real life, and outside, the sky does not care. Cooper gives instructions. The plane must land in Seattle. The money and parachutes must be delivered. Then the plane will take off again. The fuel must be enough for a longer trip toward Mexico City. He wants the stairs at the rear of the Boeing 727 to remain available. This matters, and you can feel it even now, like a small stone in your shoe. The Boeing 727 has a rear air stair that can be lowered in flight. It is a feature meant for airports without proper boarding equipment. It is not meant for midnight vanishing acts, but he knows about it. Congratulations! You have just found the first sign that this is not a random man with a bad idea. The captain circles in the air while arrangements are made. They do not land right away. There is time to negotiate, time for police to gather, time for the airline to scramble, because nobody keeps $200,000 and 4 parachutes in a tidy drawer labeled for emergencies. And all the while, the passengers remain mostly in their normal routines, because humans cling to normalcy the way they cling to railings on a boat. They read, they stare, they look out at nothing. Some of them will only understand later when they see the headlines and realize they were sitting inside history. Eventually, after about 2 hours of circling, the plane lands back in Seattle. The cabin lights feel too bright now. The airport tarmac is slick with rain. Everything outside the window looks like a reflection of itself. Cooper allows the passengers to leave once his demands are met. That is another choice that sounds merciful, but it is also practical. Less risk, less chaos, fewer people watching, fewer variables. On the ground, the negotiation becomes a quiet scramble. You can picture it easily: bright hanger lights, tired faces, coffee that has been burned on a hot plate too long, people speaking in low voices as if volume might set off the bomb. The money is collected. $200,000 in $20 bills. Not glamorous, not gold bars, not a suitcase of jewels. Just paper, the kind of paper that leaves trails. The bills are photographed and the serial numbers are recorded. This is important later, in the way that boring things always become important. The act of writing down those numbers is the investigative equivalent of putting your name on the evidence bag. It is a promise that the future might have something to hold on to. The parachutes are sourced too, 4 of them, because that is what he asked for. And that number matters too. 2 main chutes and 2 reserve chutes. Why 4? Why not 1? Because 4 makes people hesitate. 4 suggests he might take a hostage. 4 suggests he might force a crew member to jump with him. 4 suggests you should not sabotage them, because you cannot be sure who will wear them. It is a small psychological move, and it works. The FBI and local police coordinate. There are snipers, of course, because people love the idea of a clean shot. But a clean shot is mostly a fantasy. The windows are small, the angles are wrong, the risk to crew is high. And again, nobody wants to test whether that bomb is real. So the plan becomes the most human plan there is. Cooperate now, survive now. Ask questions later. The money is delivered. The parachutes are delivered. A flight attendant brings them to Cooper. He inspects them, methodical, like someone checking groceries. Then he releases the passengers. One by one, they step down the stairs into the wet night, blinking under floodlights. They are free, and most of them do not even know what they escaped. That is how close danger can sit to you, quietly, politely, without raising its hand. Now the cabin is mostly empty. The remaining crew includes the captain, the first officer, the flight engineer, and a couple of flight attendants. Cooper keeps them, not with shouting, with the steady gravity of his claim. He tells the pilots what he wants next. They will fly toward Mexico City, but with specific conditions. The plane must fly low, around 10,000 feet. The speed must be kept at about 170 knots. Slow for a jet, but manageable. The landing gear must remain down. The wing flaps must be set at a certain angle. These details are not the words of a man guessing. This is where the case becomes quietly technical. A Boeing 727 can fly like this, but it is inefficient. It burns fuel fast. It is loud. It is cold near the exits. It is not comfortable. It is a compromise designed to keep the aircraft stable enough for a jump and slow enough that the jump might be survivable. You do not need to be an engineer to feel what this means. It means he has thought about the physics, or he has talked to someone who has, or he has done this kind of thing in another life, maybe in uniform, maybe as a hobby, maybe as a job that teaches you how machines behave. The crew tries to negotiate. They suggest a different plane. They suggest different conditions. He refuses. Calmly, patiently. He is not in a hurry, which is another kind of control. The plane takes off again at around 7:40 p.m. Night has fully settled. The aircraft heads south, toward the darkness, between cities. 2 fighter jets are scrambled to follow, because this is still America in the early 1970s. And the government does not like being embarrassed. The jets shadow the Boeing 727, but in the dark and clouds, they have trouble keeping perfect sight. They are fast, too fast. They have to circle and adjust. It is almost funny, in a dry way, the way a sleek machine built for war struggles to keep pace with a slow, burdened passenger jet creeping through the rain. Inside the cabin, Cooper remains in the back. He has instructed the crew to stay in the cockpit with the door closed. One flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, is asked to stay closer for a while, to pass messages, to be the human bridge between him and the pilots. She will later describe him as polite, not kind, not warm. Polite, the difference matters. He asks for another drink. He may smoke. The reports vary, because memory is a soft substance under stress. But there is enough talk of cigarettes, enough cigarette butts, enough smoke in the culture of that era that you can almost smell it anyway. It is strange to think about now. An airplane cabin full of smoke, a hijacker sipping bourbon, and everyone trying to act like the rules still apply. But that is how humans cope. They keep the little rituals going because the alternative is to stare at the abyss. You watch Cooper through Tina's eyes. Middle-aged, maybe mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, average build, dark hair, neatly combed, a face that does not hook your attention. That is his greatest weapon. He is a blank page people try to write on later. The famous composite sketch will come from these impressions, and it will be both helpful and useless, because it looks like 1,000 men you have passed in airports, hardware stores, and office buildings. And that is another reason this case stays unsolved. A face that blends in is a face that can belong to anyone. Cooper speaks in short sentences. He does not ramble. He does not monologue. He does not try to be remembered. He corrects small details as if he hates inefficiency. At one point, he tells Tina to write down the flight instructions for the cockpit. Another small, practical move. Words spoken can be misheard. Words written can be followed. Meanwhile, The crew does the quiet math of survival. How far can they fly with the gear down and flaps set? Where can they land if they need to? What happens if he changes his mind? What happens if the bomb is real? What happens if it is not? And the passengers are gone now. That is the eerie part. Most hijackings have an audience of terrified civilians. Here, it is mostly professionals, people trained to keep their faces neutral, people whose fear is packed away behind procedure. The cabin hum is steady. The lights are low. Outside is only black, with occasional scattered pearls of town lights. Rivers appear as darker lines, forests as thicker darkness. The Pacific Northwest at night is not a landscape, it is a suggestion. You realize, slowly, what he has chosen. He has chosen weather. He has chosen wilderness. He has chosen the kind of terrain that does not like giving back what it takes. The plane crosses into southwestern Washington. The pilots follow his instructions. They remain on a route that roughly goes over woodland, aerial, and toward the area near the Lewis River. Again, the exact path becomes an argument later because radar coverage and timing and recollections do not stitch together into one perfect quilt. But you can feel the truth anyway. They are moving over wet, cold ground, heavy with trees. Inside the cockpit, the crew hears something. A thump, a shift in air pressure, a warning light. The rear air stair indicator shows movement. The stairs are being lowered. This is the moment that always gets dramatized. The jump, the vanishing, the legend stepping into the dark. But from the inside, it is not dramatic. It is mechanical. The rear of the Boeing 727 is not romantic when the air stairs open in flight. It is loud. Wind roars like a living thing. Cold air slams into the cabin. The plane shudders slightly, like it is annoyed. The crew cannot see him now. The cockpit door is closed, as he demanded. Tina has been sent forward. She is in the cockpit with the others. Her hands are probably cold. Her mouth tastes like stress. They can only infer what is happening behind them. By vibrations, by sounds, by instrument readings. And you, listening, realize something else. This whole act depends on a private moment in the back of a plane. A moment with no witnesses, no cameras, no clear sightline. The most important seconds of the entire case happen where nobody can see. Congratulations. That is how you get a mystery that lasts for decades. At around 8:13 p.m., the pilots feel a distinct change, a stronger movement, a downward pull, as if weight has shifted and then left. The aircraft bobs. It is subtle, but it is there. That is the best timestamp investigators ever get for the jump. Not a clear visual, not a last shouted line, just a plane reacting to physics. A man, somewhere behind them, has stepped into storm and darkness, and then there is only the hum again. The same engines, the same instruments, but the cabin is emptier. A seat is vacant. An absence has formed. The crew waits. They do not immediately open the door because the bomb might still be there. Because caution is what you do when you want to live. Eventually, they land in Reno, Nevada, just after 10 p.m. to refuel. The plane is met by law enforcement. They sweep the cabin. They find the tie clip. They find cigarette butts, maybe. They find the abandoned briefcase. They do not find Cooper. They do not find a bomb either. And in the way of real investigations, the dramatic moment is over and the boring work begins. Because now you have a missing man in an enormous landscape, at night, in bad weather, with money and parachutes and unknown injuries, or no injuries at all. The search is not a cinematic montage. It is wet boots and tired eyes. But before you can even get to the muddy reality of those mornings, your mind drifts back to what happened on the ground while the plane was refueling and waiting and stalling in Seattle. Because that is where the paper trail begins. That is where the practical choices were made. And while the aircraft kept moving through the dark like nothing was wrong, the people on the ground were doing the most human thing possible. They were watching the clock and trying not to imagine the worst. Down there, under hangar lights that make everyone look a little sickly, you watch adults in ties and uniforms do something they hate doing: improvise. Not the fun kind. The kind where every option has a body count attached to it. You stand near a desk that has too many phones on it, each one ringing like it has an opinion. Airline operations wants one thing, law enforcement wants another, and the flight crew wants the same thing crews always want: for the plane to land with everyone still breathing. The clock becomes a character. It sits in the room with you. It makes every conversation shorter. $200,000 is not sitting around waiting to be kidnapped. In 1971, it is still real money, heavy money. The unromantic kind that comes in brick-shaped bundles and smells like paper dust, ink, and other people's hands. So you end up watching a strange little ballet. Bank people get called. Federal agents start giving instructions that sound confident, but are stitched together fast. Someone has to decide the denomination, and it lands on $20 bills. Because it is common and available. It is also a nightmare to count, which is a nice reminder that crime is rarely convenient. You picture the bills sliding through counting machines, the dull click and flutter. You picture tired fingers doing it by hand anyway, because machines jam and people do not trust them when a bomb is involved. Then comes the part that feels like a detail, until it doesn't. The serial numbers. A person sits down and records them, row after row, long strings of ink that mean nothing to the human brain. But those numbers are not for your brain. They are for the future. They are for that day years later when a bill shows up somewhere it should not be, and the past clears its throat. They photograph the money too, because this is how investigations actually look. Not heroism, not gunfire, a camera flash, a clipboard, a man squinting at ink under fluorescent light. You would think parachutes would be the hard part, and they are. Not because parachutes are rare, but because the right kind of parachute at the right time in the right place is always going to be a problem. You watch someone make calls that feel absurd. Who has chutes? Who can deliver them? Who has reserves? Who has something that will at least pass for what was demanded? And while the phones keep ringing, you notice a quieter argument forming in the room. It is not said out loud at first. It is just there, under the words. Should they sabotage the parachutes? It is the kind of thought that arrives wearing practical shoes. If you give him a chute that fails, he cannot get away. If you give him a reserve that is useless, you narrow his options. And if you are the kind of person who believes in tidy endings, it sounds almost clean. But then you remember the number, 4 parachutes. And you remember what 4 implies. 4 says he might take a hostage. 4 says he might force a flight attendant to jump. 4 says you could be murdering someone who never volunteered for the role. Congratulations, you have just met the part of policing that does not fit on television. The part where you do not get to be clever, because clever could get someone killed. So the decision leans toward cooperation. Give him real parachutes. Give him something that works. Survive now. Solve later. Even then, reality slips in sideways. Not every parachute delivered is the same. Some are sport rigs, designed for controlled jumps. Some are older, military style. Some are training chutes. Some have features a professional would notice, and an amateur would not. This will matter later, the way small differences always matter when you are trying to reconstruct a night from scraps. You keep your eyes on the paperwork, because paperwork is the true currency of any investigation. The money is bundled. The chutes are tagged. The chain of custody begins imperfectly, because it always begins imperfectly in a crisis. And outside, through wet glass, the aircraft sits like a patient animal in the rain. Lights blink, engines are quiet for now. A set of stairs waits at the rear, the kind you would normally ignore. You can almost feel the tension in the people on the tarmac. Snipers are positioned, because snipers are always positioned when people are scared. They want a clean answer. They want to believe in the single-shot solution. But you have stood in enough bad rooms to know better. There is almost no such thing as a clean shot. There are reflections, angles, movement, the possibility of a bomb, real or not, being triggered by panic. And there is the biggest problem of all. You cannot see what he will do if he realizes he is cornered. Cornered people do messy things, so the plan stays dull, because dull keeps people alive. The money goes in, the parachutes go in, and you feel the moment everyone pretends not to exhale. It is not relief. It is just the next step. Then the passengers are released, and that part always sounds kind on paper, but you can hear the practicality in it. Fewer people, fewer variables, a smaller stage, less noise. Now comes the uncomfortable quiet, a plane with only crew and the man in the back. On the ground, you watch the last ordinary pieces get packed away. A coffee cup shoved aside, a report half written, a phone finally set down, and then the aircraft moves again. And you lose the only thing you ever really want: control. Once it lifts off, you are left with radar screens and radio calls. The kind of information that sounds clear until you try to use it later. You sit with the people who are listening to the cockpit transmissions. The captain's voice stays level. That voice is a tool, like a wrench. It keeps everyone from spiraling. Cooper's instructions come through in chunks: altitude, speed, flaps, gear. A route that is more suggestion than line, because weather and air traffic do not respect anyone's plan. The problem with tracking an aircraft in that era is that it is not like your glowing map app. Radar has gaps. Terrain interferes. Timing matters. Human error matters. And while you are trying to piece together a path, the plane is already somewhere else. You want to mark the moment of the jump. You want it pinned down like a butterfly. But all you really get is that subtle change the pilots felt, and a general window of time. So the search area becomes huge, because the sky is huge, and the ground is huge, and your certainty is tiny. By morning, The story has already started turning into legend, and you hate that part. Legends are loud. They attract the wrong kind of attention. They invite people to treat evidence like a souvenir, but you do not get to choose the cultural reaction. You only get to choose how you work inside it. You drive out with search teams. And if you have never done this kind of thing, you might imagine it as organized lines of people sweeping through the woods like a well-drilled army. It is not like that. It is small teams, mud, wet branches that slap at your sleeves, radios that crackle with nothing useful, a map that looks confident until you are standing in the actual forest and everything looks the same. The Pacific Northwest in late November is not a friendly place to wander. The air is cold enough to sting the inside of your nose. Rain comes and goes, sometimes fine as mist, sometimes heavy enough to sound like static on your coat. The ground is soft, which feels promising for footprints, until you realize soft ground turns to mush under more rain, and whatever story it held gets smeared into a blur. You follow the logic anyway. If he jumped somewhere along that rough flight path, he had to come down somewhere. If he came down somewhere, there should be a chute. If there is a chute, there might be rope, fabric, harness, metal hardware that catches light. But the land does not cooperate. Trees catch things. Rivers move things. Animals drag things. Time erases the edges. And the truth you keep circling is simple. If he landed badly, the forest could keep him. If he landed well, the forest could still keep him, just in a different way. You start hearing theories almost immediately, and they arrive like mosquitoes. Everyone has one. Everyone says it with the same confident tone. He was ex-military. He was a professional skydiver. He was an airline mechanic. He was local. He was not local. He died on impact. He walked out and went to breakfast. But theories are cheap. Evidence is not. So you focus on what you actually know. The jump was done at night, in weather, from a Boeing 727 moving at a controlled but still serious speed at low altitude, but not low enough to be gentle. You picture the air stare down, wind tearing past it, a man stepping backward into roaring air, no jump light, no clear signal, just timing and nerve. If he used a sport parachute, you wonder about steering. If he used a round canopy, you wonder about drift. Wind at altitude is not the same as wind on the ground. It can push you sideways for miles while you think you are descending in a straight line. And he was carrying money. $200,000 in 20s, weighs around 22 pounds, give or take. It is not crushing, but it is not nothing. It pulls at your balance. It tugs while you fall. It turns a clean jump into an awkward one. Then there is his clothing, a suit, a trench coat, loafers possibly. Not the gear of someone planning a comfortable landing. Not in rain. Not in cold. If you are trying to be generous, you say he was confident. If you are trying to be realistic, you say he may have been gambling. The teams search anyway. They sweep fields and forest. They look along roads because people love roads when they are lost. They check power lines because parachutes snag there. They walk riverbanks because a descent can end in water. Days pass, then weeks, and the reality sets in like dampness in your socks. There may be nothing to find. This is the part most people do not understand about investigations. They think you find clues because you look hard enough. They think persistence creates evidence, but evidence is not obligated to exist. You can be thorough and still come back empty-handed, and you still have to write it all down. Every grid searched, every coordinate, every team deployed, every dog that found nothing but deer scent and old beer cans. Bureaucracy does not stop for mystery. It just stacks the mystery neatly in a file. You return to offices where the air is dry and smells like paper. Maps get pinned to boards. Threads get drawn. Everyone tries to make the geography behave. They estimate the drop zone using the flight path, speed, time, and the moment that shift was felt. They factor in wind data, imperfect as it is. They draw a rough ellipse, an area of probability. It is still enormous, and that is when the case begins its long, quiet transformation. From an event to an investigation. From an investigation to a problem. You sit with witness statements next, because when the woods refuse to speak, you go back to humans, even though humans are famously unreliable. Passengers describe a man who seemed normal, a man who did not stand out, a man who may have had a tan, or maybe it was the cabin lighting, a man with sunglasses, or maybe not, a man who was polite, a man who was calm. The flight attendants remember more because they had to. They remember his voice, low and controlled. They remember his hands, steady. They remember he tipped for the drinks, which is such a strange detail it becomes famous. He ordered bourbon and soda. He lit a cigarette, possibly Raleigh brand, and left behind cigarette butts that later got collected because even in 1971, people understood saliva and ash could carry traces. But those traces are not what you would hope. Not then. Not with the technology of the time. Deoxyribonucleic acid is not yet the magic key people think it is now. The future is coming, but slowly, like a tired person climbing stairs. They also collect the black clip-on tie he left behind. A simple, boring object. A little rectangle of fabric that sat against his throat all evening. You do not know yet that this tie will become one of the most discussed pieces of the whole case. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is stubborn. It stays. It waits. It ages into relevance. At the time, it is just another item in an evidence bag, tagged and logged, then stored, then forgotten for stretches, then pulled again when someone gets hopeful. You follow the paper trail of the ticket purchase too. The name Dan Cooper, the cash payment, the time, the clerk who sold it, the lack of meaningful identification. In that era, anonymity is easy. You do not need to be a mastermind. You just need to be dull. And Cooper was dull in all the right ways. The sketch gets made, of course. It has to. People need a face to hunt. The artist sits with the crew, asking them to remember shapes, hairline, eyes, mouth. Memory is not a photograph. It is a story you keep retelling, and each retelling changes the edges. The sketch that comes out is competent. It is also generic. A middle-aged white man in a suit, neat hair, composed expression. It is the kind of face you would see in an office and forget by lunch. So tips flood in, thousands. People call in ex-husbands, neighbors, co-workers, men they saw once at a bar who looked like that sketch, men who are dead, men who are alive, men who are guilty of being average. This is what fame does to a case. It creates noise, and noise is the enemy of sleep and the enemy of truth. You as the weary investigator in the room starts sorting the noise into piles. Credible, not credible. Interesting, but impossible. Emotional, but useless. And still, you keep coming back to that list of demands because it is one of the few places the man's mind shows itself. Money, yes, but not too much. Parachutes, yes, but 4. A specific aircraft, a Boeing 727 because of the rear air sare. A specific flight profile because he wanted the conditions for a jump. These are not random cravings, they are choices. So you start asking the only question that matters. What kind of man makes those choices? The Bureau starts leaning toward a profile, the way it always does. Military experience is suggested because of the calm, the planning, the familiarity with aircraft. Maybe Air Force, maybe Army, maybe a paratrooper, maybe someone who worked around cargo planes. But there are problems with that neat idea. A trained jumper would know the dangers of jumping into that weather in a suit and loafers. A trained jumper would likely choose better gear, or at least better timing, unless he was trained long ago and his confidence outlasted his skill. Unless he was trained in a different context where risk was normal and survival was assumed. This is where human psychology slips into the file like a shadow. Some people do not update their self-image. They keep believing they are 25, even when their knees say otherwise. Some people plan crimes the way you plan a diet, always starting Monday, always imagining the version of yourself who will follow through perfectly. And then, on the night it matters, reality arrives with weather and gravity. You also learn quickly that a person does not need to be a skydiver to pull off a jump. The parachute will open if you pull the cord. The hard part is everything else: landing, navigation, survival, and not getting caught afterward. The case begins to hinge on that afterward, because even if he survived, he had to emerge somewhere. He had to walk, or hitchhike, or meet someone. He had to show up wet, maybe injured, carrying a bag of cash. He had to become a person again. So you look at roads near the probable drop zone. You look at small towns. You look at bars, motels, gas stations. You ask if anyone saw a man out of place that night, and people shrug, because that is what people do when they are asked to remember a single stranger from a rainy night years ago. Some reports come in anyway. A man walking along a road, a man in the woods, a man who seemed muddy, a man who asked for directions. Nothing holds. Nothing becomes a thread you can pull without it snapping. You also examine the parachutes that were given to him, because those details matter more than they seem. One of the reserve chutes delivered was not a steerable parachute. It was a dummy reserve used for training, sewn shut in a way that made it useless. Whether Cooper realized this is debated. Some think he chose the wrong chute, suggesting he was not as knowledgeable as people assume. Others argue he did not need the reserve and did not care. He may have selected the main chute and ignored the rest, using the extra chutes only as leverage to prevent sabotage. Either way, the detail sits there like a pebble in your mind. It does not solve anything. It just irritates your certainty. And certainty, in this case, is always the first thing to die. The investigation stretches on, and you get familiar with the dull ache of it, the endless checking, the interviews, the follow-ups that lead nowhere. People mail in letters claiming to be Cooper. People confess. People recant. People send in poems and coded messages because they want to be touched by the story. You learn to recognize the scent of attention-seeking. It is sharp and sweet and fake. Meanwhile, the actual evidence stays small. A tie, some cigarette butts, a note, or rather, the memory of a note, because the original ransom note itself does not survive in the public imagination the way you would expect. The money, of course, is the big one. It is the one thing you can track. Serial numbers do not care about legends, so agents circulate lists of recorded serial numbers to banks and businesses. If any of those bills show up, someone is supposed to notice. In theory, in practice, $20 bills move like water. They get spent, folded, lost, burned, stuffed into wallets, handed to bartenders, dropped in gutters. And in 1971, not every cashier is trained to check serial numbers. Not every bank teller is looking at every bill. People are busy living, and the world is not built to support meticulous vigilance. So months pass, then years, and the money does not surface, which is, in its own way, a piece of evidence. If Cooper lived and tried to spend it in large amounts, he risked detection. If he tried to spend it slowly, it could disappear into ordinary commerce. But the absence of hits suggests he either did not spend much, or he never had the chance, or he buried it, or he lost it, or it scattered in the jump, bills fluttering into darkness like dead leaves. That last image is hard to ignore. Money pouring out of a bag in free fall, spreading wide. And you hate it because it makes the story feel poetic, and poetry is rarely true. Still, physics is not poetry. It is just physics. A bag can tear, a strap can slip, fingers go numb in cold air. Wind does not negotiate. You revisit the flight itself again and again, because it is one of the few fixed things in the case. The route, the timing, the conditions. You look at wind data. You look at the aircraft speed. You look at the angle of descent. A Boeing 727 with the rear stairs down creates drag. It changes performance. It makes the aircraft behave differently. The pilots were flying a strange profile, low and slow, with gear down. That affects the timing and the location of the jump. And the jets following them, those sleek fighters, did not maintain perfect formation. They were too fast. They had to loop. They lost visual contact at times. Clouds swallowed everything. So even the watchers did not really watch. You end up with an investigation built around negative space, around what you cannot see, around what the night did not record. And that is why the case grows into a lullaby for the morbidly curious. Because it is a story shaped like a question, and the question is wide enough for anyone to crawl into. But you are not here for anyone. You're here for the evidence, the boring edges, the places where reality peeks through. So you keep sifting. You learn about early suspect lists, men with aviation backgrounds, men with parachute experience, men with grudges, men with debts, men who vanished or died soon after. Some names become famous in later decades, offered up by authors and amateur sleuths, each one presented as the final answer, the perfect fit, the one true Cooper. But perfect fits are usually tailored. A suspect will match the height, but not the ears, the age, but not the behavior, the military background, but not the technical knowledge, the handwriting, but not the timeline. And the timeline always matters because unlike stories, time does not bend for drama. You sit with the investigators who did this for a living, and you notice how tired they sound, even in old recordings. They talk about leads that seemed promising, then dissolved. They talk about tips that arrived in floods, most of them useless. They talk about the case the way you talk about a chronic ache. It flares up, it fades, it never entirely leaves. One day, you were looking at aircraft manuals and learning about the rear air stair mechanism. Because the simplest question is still alive: how did he know? The Boeing 727 was known for that feature, yes, but most passengers do not memorize aircraft quirks. They sit, they land, they complain about coffee, they do not plan exits. So you explore the possibility he had worked around planes, perhaps as ground crew, perhaps as a mechanic, perhaps as someone who loaded cargo and watched the stairs come down at small airports. Or perhaps he simply read, manuals exist. People forget that. You can learn a lot from paper if you are patient. And patience is what this crime radiates. The calm demands, the careful leverage of 4 parachutes. The choice of a short, forgettable flight. It is not flashy, it is methodical. That methodical feeling becomes even sharper when you consider what he did not do. He did not harm anyone. He did not rant. He did not ask for publicity. He did not seem to want fear for its own sake. Fear was just a tool to move the pieces. In that way, the crime feels almost like a transaction, a grim negotiation between a man and a system. And systems, you know, hate being negotiated with. The Federal Bureau of Investigation puts resources into it. Of course they do. It is public. It is embarrassing. It is also a challenge, and bureaucracies are like people. They take challenges personally. The case gets a name because everything gets a name. It goes into files. It spawns memos. It becomes a living document. And still, the forest stays quiet. You hear about search flights over the suspected drop zones, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, men on the ground with radios and maps. You hear about divers checking waterways, because if he hit a river, the current could take evidence far from the jump. You hear about hikers who think they found something, only for it to be old canvas or a scrap of tarp. The landscape is full of false clues, because humans leave trash everywhere. It is one of our most consistent behaviors. As time goes on, you notice another problem growing: contamination. Every year that passes, more people walk those woods, more people hunt, more people camp, more people stumble across something and touch it, move it, keep it. Even if a piece of Cooper's gear sat out there, waiting, the odds of it staying pristine are almost laughable. Evidence does not like moisture. It does not like sunlight. It does not like animals. It does not like curious hands. So the case slowly shifts from a hunt for a body or a shoot to a hunt for something else, a mistake. Because criminals almost always make mistakes. They get arrogant, they get careless. They tell someone. They spend the money in a way that draws attention. They get drunk and nostalgic and talk too much. That is usually how it goes. But Cooper, if he lived, may have done the most boring thing a criminal can do. He may have shut up. You imagine him years later, sitting in some modest house, reading about himself in the newspaper with a neutral face. You imagine him clipping an article, or burning it, or ignoring it entirely. Some people commit a crime and then turn it into their personality. They cannot resist telling. They want to be recognized. Others commit a crime like they close a door. quietly, completely, and then they go back to work on Monday. That possibility is its own kind of horror, not because it is dramatic, but because it is ordinary. And yet, the money. You cannot let go of the money, because money is supposed to move. It is supposed to surface. It is supposed to betray you with serial numbers. So when it does not, you keep circling back, asking the same tired questions in different wording. Did he survive? Did he lose the money in the jump? Did he hide it? Did he die and the money died with him? Did someone else find it and keep it quiet? The worst part is that each answer is plausible, and plausibility is not proof. Years pass, and the case becomes one of those stories people tell with a faint smile, like it is a harmless mystery. A sky pirate, a folk villain, a clever man who got away. You do not smile. You have seen what people do when they romanticize crime. They start thinking of it as a game. This was not a game for the crew that night. It was their job and their fear and their hands shaking while they poured bourbon for a stranger with a bomb. So you stay grounded. You stay with the human details. Tina Mucklow, for example, will live with those memories. Florence Schaffner will live with that note. The pilots will remember the way the aircraft lurched. Those are real souvenirs, not the legend. And as the investigation keeps grinding, the case draws in the public like a moth to porch light. Armchair detectives form theories. Authors sell suspects. Families insist they knew the man. Every few years, someone new emerges as the likely Cooper, and the story spins up again like an old record. But you keep your eyes on the few stubborn artifacts: the tie, the cigarette butts, the flight path, the parachute types, the money list. And you keep noticing the same pattern. Every promising suspect eventually runs into one hard wall. They cannot be placed on that plane, or they cannot be removed from somewhere else, or their skills do not match the choices, or their confession falls apart under scrutiny. Perfect is always a lie wearing a cheap suit. So the case stays open in that irritating limbo way. Not solved, not forgotten, just waiting. And then, long after the jump has faded into old news, the case gets its first real whisper from the ground. Not a body, not a parachute, not a dramatic discovery, just paper showing up where paper should not be. But that part takes time to arrive, and time is the true element of this story. Time and rain and the patient way the world erases footprints. So for now, you keep walking the search grids in your mind, listening to radios crackle, watching men in rain gear bend to inspect yet another piece of nothing. And you understand, in a slow and slightly bitter way, why the morning after is always the hardest part. The dramatic moment is done. All that is left is the work and the quiet possibility that the woods already decided the ending, and nobody thought to ask them nicely. So you go back inside, where the fluorescent lights flatten everything into paperwork again, because the woods do not testify, but documents always do. You sit at a metal desk that feels slightly tacky from old varnish, and you start doing the thing nobody puts in movies. You reread. You reread until the words stop feeling like a story and start feeling like a system. The first system is the money. $200,000 in $20 bills, each one with a serial number recorded like a prayer. You imagine those numbers, long and indifferent, sitting in files for years, waiting for a cashier, a teller, a board bank employee, to notice one strange match, and what happens instead is silence. Not the peaceful silence people want at bedtime, the investigative silence that makes your jaw tighten. Because money is supposed to move, money is supposed to betray you, unless it never entered circulation. Unless it entered and nobody noticed. Unless it entered and someone noticed and decided they liked their quiet life better than being a footnote in a federal investigation. You learn slowly that all three are possible and none of them are satisfying. You also learn how easily a case like this becomes a cabinet with too many drawers. There is the drawer for the flight crew statements, each one written in the careful language of someone trying not to be blamed. There is the drawer for airline memos, full of polite corporate phrasing that still smells like panic underneath. There is the drawer for search reports, each page a small obituary for hope. Grid searched, negative result, no recovery. And then there is the drawer that grows the fastest, tips from the public. Letters, phone calls, handwritten confessions, blurry photographs, and the occasional piece of evidence that turns out to be a scrap of parachute from a training jump 2 decades earlier. You start to recognize the pattern because you have seen it in other cases. When the truth is thin, imagination becomes fat. People do not just want an answer. They want ownership of the answer. They want to be the person who solved it, the person who saw what nobody else saw, the person who finally made the world make sense. Congratulations, you have just met the true engine of amateur investigation. It is not justice. It is ego wearing a detective hat. So you keep your own hat low and you stay with the few pieces that do not change: the tie, the parachutes, the flight profile, and that odd choice that still irritates your certainty. 4 parachutes, not 1. You let yourself sit with it because it is a rare thing in this case. A choice with edges. 4 parachutes forces the authorities to behave. It makes sabotage dangerous. It makes snipers hesitate. It makes everyone picture a flight attendant being dragged into the rear of the plane and shoved toward the open stairwell. And in the end, whether he intended to take a hostage or not, he got what he needed: real parachutes, delivered fast. It is a simple psychological trick, and it works the way simple tricks always work, because people are predictable when fear is involved. You turn to the parachute details next, because they are strangely human. Despite all the canvas and hardware, one of the reserve chutes was a training chute, sewn shut, basically a prop meant to teach people how to wear it. If Cooper selected it thinking it was functional, that suggests ignorance. If he ignored it because he only needed one main canopy, that suggests calculation. If he grabbed whichever was closest because the reserve was never the plan, that suggests something else entirely. That the chutes were leverage, not equipment. And you notice how easily people turn that one detail into whatever they already believe. If they want him to be a professional, they say he did not care. If they want him to be an amateur, they say he made a rookie mistake. It is like watching people read fortunes into coffee grounds, except the coffee grounds are federal evidence. You keep going anyway, because you do not get to be precious about it. You look at what he wore: a suit, a trench coat, loafers, a thin clip-on tie. You picture the rear stairs down, air roaring in, and you try to imagine stepping into that with bare hands, no gloves. Late November air at 10,000 feet is not romantic. It bites. It numbs. Your fingers lose finesse first, and finesse is what you need for straps, buckles, cords, knots. Then you add rain and wind and the chaos of that stairwell, a slanted metal staircase vibrating under force, the aircraft bucking gently like it is irritated at being used this way. And then you add the money. A bag of 20s is not a dragon horde. It is not cinematic. It is just weight pulling at your center of gravity, swinging when you move, trying to turn you sideways at the worst possible moment. So you let the case be what it is, not a legend, but a physics problem, wrapped in human arrogance. A man steps into air. Air does what air does. Bodies do what bodies do. And the forest keeps its secrets the way it always has, by being larger than you. In the months after the jump, you watch the investigation try to squeeze that forest into manageable shapes. They run flight path reconstructions. They argue about the exact moment of the bump the pilots felt. They compare radar logs, which in that era are not a crisp digital trail, but a series of marks and approximations. They pull weather data, wind direction and speed, and they try to model drift. Drift is one of those words that sounds gentle, like a boat on a lake. But in skydiving terms, drift is the difference between landing in a field and landing in a river. It is the difference between walking out and never being found. You look at maps with circles and ovals drawn in pencil, and you notice something that always happens in these cases. The more you calculate, the more you realize what you do not know. Did he open the canopy immediately or delay? Did he fall stable or tumble? Did the money bag drag him? Did he hit trees and get hung up? Did he land and cut the canopy away? Did the canopy collapse into a stream and get carried off in silence? Every unknown makes the search area breathe outward. And then there is the simplest unknown, the one nobody likes to say out loud. Did he even jump where you think he did? Because you are relying on the aircraft's reaction and timing. You are relying on the assumption that the bump happened when the man left the plane, not when he moved around inside it, not when the stairs shifted further, not when the wind caught the structure in a new way. You want the universe to give you a timestamp. The universe shrugs. So the Bureau keeps working the parts it can actually touch people. You dig into airports, skydiving clubs, military bases, aviation workplaces. You look for someone who knew the Boeing 727's rear stair capability, because that is still one of the rare details that feels sharp. You talk to pilots, mechanics, former paratroopers. You collect names the way you collect cigarette ash. Careful, tedious, never sure which spec matters. And while you do, you keep hearing the same comforting myth repeated by people who want it to be true. A trained paratrooper could do this easily. But you know what trained paratroopers actually do? They jump with proper gear in planned conditions with a drop zone and a recovery plan. They do not jump alone at night in civilian clothes into a storm with a bag of money tied to their body. Yes, training helps, but training does not make you immune to bad choices. If anything, training sometimes makes you overconfident. You have seen that too, the way some people treat experience like armor, even after the armor rusted. So you keep your mind open to a less flattering possibility. Maybe Cooper was not a professional. Maybe he was a man who read enough, planned enough, and believed enough in his own cleverness to gamble his body against the weather, because that kind of man exists in every decade. He is sitting in a bar right now, somewhere, explaining how he would do it better than the people who actually did it. The investigation also has to deal with something that feels petty until you remember that petty things break cases. The name, Dan Cooper, not D.B. Cooper. That D.B. part comes from a confusion, a misheard name, a reporter's error that sticks because it sounds better. And once it sticks, it becomes the mask the world recognizes. You watch the authorities use it anyway because fighting the public is like yelling at the rain. The rain does not care. So D.B. Cooper becomes a headline, and the man becomes a character. And characters attract the kind of people who want to be near them. That is when the letters start. People confess, sometimes in shaky handwriting, sometimes in smug little typed notes. Some claim they did it because they want attention. Some claim they did it because they are mentally unwell. Some claim they did it because they are bored and want to see if the government will knock on their door. You learn to read these communications the way you read a bad alibi, not for what they say, but for what they avoid. Real participants tend to include unglamorous detail. They mention the taste of cabin air, the feel of cheap carpeting, the awkwardness of buckling a strap. Fake participants talk in headlines. They talk in punchlines. They talk the way people talk when they want you to clap. So most of it goes nowhere, and the case keeps crawling forward, slow as a tired animal. Then the years start stacking up, and something changes. Not the evidence, the culture. In the 1970s, the case is current, sharp-edged, a bruise. By the 1980s, it becomes something else, a story people tell at parties, a weird American fairy tale. And when the culture shifts, the investigation has to shift with it. Because now, people who were children during the hijacking are adults, and they have ideas, and they have hobbies, and they have basements full of filing cabinets. They submit their own suspects. They run their own timelines. They send in their own composites. You can feel the Bureau's patience wearing thin in the memos, because federal agents are not built to be customer service. But the Bureau cannot ignore tips. Not entirely. So they do what investigators always do. They triage. You watch the triage happen. Tips get sorted by proximity, plausibility, and whether they can be checked without lighting the whole budget on fire. And the truth is, most tips cannot be checked. They are vague. They are late. They are built on someone's cousin's friend who knew a guy who once said something. This is the swamp where cases go to drown. Still, a handful of suspects do rise above the sludge, not because they are perfect, but because they are checkable. Men with military backgrounds, men with parachute experience, men who changed their behavior after the hijacking, got nervous, got secretive, got weird with money. Men whose families later say, in that soft, haunted way, that something was always off. You sit with those family statements and you feel the tragedy behind them. Because sometimes families want their relative to be Cooper for the strangest reason. It would explain things. It would make the uncle's silence meaningful. It would make the father's drinking into guilt. It would give shape to a lifetime of feeling like they never really knew the man in their house. But wanting an explanation is not the same as having one. So you keep your cynicism close, and you keep asking for what you always ask for. Placement. Put the suspect on the plane. Show the ticket purchase. Show the airport. Show the face. Because without that, you are just writing fan fiction with footnotes. and this case has always been mostly footnotes. Then, as if the world gets bored of not giving you anything, it finally offers a real artifact again. Not from the sky, but from the ground. It happens years later. In 1980, you are not in a smoky office now or a rainy search grid. You are on a riverbank, on a stretch of sand along the Columbia River, near a place called Bar. The name sounds gentle, like a picnic spot, and it is, sometimes. But today, you are watching a child dig in the sand. A kid named Brian Ingram is on a family outing, and he is doing what kids do, poking at the earth, making little holes, looking for treasure in the way only children can. And he finds it. Not gold, not a skull, paper. 3 packets of $20 bills, deteriorated, stuck together, smelling like river mud and time. You crouch in your imagination beside that hole in the sand, and you can feel your pulse change because you recognize the shape of a case waking up. They check the serial numbers. They match the ransom money. Not similar, not maybe, a match. It is the first time the case speaks in a voice that is not rumor. And the problem, of course, is that the voice does not say what you want it to say. It just whispers, "I was here." 3 bundles, roughly $5,800 total, though the exact amount depends on how you count what is salvageable. The bills are damaged, edges ragged, ink faded. They look like something the river chewed on for a decade. And now you have a new set of questions, the kind that keep you awake for years. How did the money get here? Bar is not directly under the most commonly proposed flight path. Not neatly. It is downstream, a place where water collects things. If Cooper died and the money ended up in a river, maybe it traveled. If Cooper buried money somewhere and the river later eroded it out, maybe it traveled. If someone found money and buried part of it for reasons nobody understands, maybe it did not travel much at all. You look at the bundles and you notice the rubber bands. Or rather, you notice what is left of them. Rubber does not like time. It cracks, it dissolves. But the presence or absence, the way the bills are stacked, the condition of the paper, all of it becomes a little forensics puzzle. You consult what experts said over the years. Some suggest the money could have been buried intentionally because the bundles were still grouped. Others point out that rivers can deposit grouped items in strange ways, especially if the bills were trapped in debris or inside something that later opened. The problem is, every explanation has a counter-explanation. That is the curse of partial evidence. It narrows the universe, but it does not collapse it. You also have to sit with the cold possibility the find suggests that the money never got spent because the man never got a chance. If the money was lost in the jump, scattered, some could have ended up in waterways. If he landed badly and drowned, the money could have followed. If he survived but lost part of the cash, he might have kept what he could and left the rest to the river. And if he survived and kept most of it, the river find might be a meaningless scrap, a few bundles that slipped away like change in a couch. The case gives you a clue and then laughs quietly at your desire for a clean interpretation. Congratulations, you have just received evidence that creates more questions than answers. That is what real life calls a gift. So the Bureau does what it always does when it gets a gift like that. It reopens lines of thought that had gone stale. They reconsider the drop zone. They look harder at water routes. They ask whether Cooper could have come down closer to tributaries feeding the Columbia. They revisit wind data, again, with slightly better modeling than they had in 1971. They interview people again, even though memory by now is a fragile fossil. And in the background, the case begins to split into tribes. One tribe believes the money proves he died, because dead men do not spend cash. Another tribe believes the money proves he lived, because only a living man could have hidden it, or moved it, or decided to discard part of it. Another tribe believes it proves nothing at all, because nature is a shredder and the river is a liar. You listen to all of them, and you keep your own voice low and tired, because you know the truth is allowed to be boring. The truth might simply be, some money ended up in a river, and the rest did not. And the reason might be something stupid and unromantic, like a torn bag, or a bad knot, or numb fingers. Then the tie comes back into focus, years later, the way old evidence sometimes does when technology catches up. That clip-on tie, left on the seat like an afterthought, gets tested more deeply decades after the hijacking. Not for drama, for particles, microscopic stuff, tiny traces of metal and manufacturing residue caught in the weave. Investigators and researchers find small amounts of rare earth elements and pure titanium and other particles that suggest Cooper may have worked around certain industrial environments, maybe aerospace, maybe a chemical plant, maybe a manufacturing facility where those materials were common. It is not a fingerprint. It is not a confession. It is the kind of clue that feels exciting for about 10 seconds until you realize how many jobs could fit it. Still, it gives you a new picture to hold. Not a suave sky pirate, a man who might have worn that tie to work in a place where machinery hummed and metal dust clung to fabric. A man who might have been technical, or at least adjacent to technical work. A man who might have known aircraft, not because he flew them, but because he fixed things near them. And that fits the tone of the crime, doesn't it? Methodical, practical, quiet. A plan that feels like it came from someone who reads manuals, who follows procedures, who understands systems well enough to exploit them. You start thinking about the way he spoke to the crew. Polite, controlled, no swearing, no tantrums. That is the voice of someone who has lived inside rules, even if he now breaks them. And you think about the bomb, because the bomb is the heart of the leverage. If it was real, he risked his own life on that aircraft. If it was fake, he risked everything on the crew believing him. Either way, it is a gamble. And gamblers, in your experience, usually gamble again. So you wait for the second act that never comes. No copycat with the same method succeeds in quite the same way. No confirmed spending spree turns up. No deathbed confession with checkable detail lands cleanly on a desk. Just noise and theories and the occasional new suspect who looks good until he doesn't. And that is where your weary mind starts doing what it always does, comparing. Because one unresolved case is never alone. It sits on a shelf beside other questions, other disappearances, other quiet crimes that refuse to wrap themselves neatly. And once you let your attention drift, you start seeing the same anatomy in all of them. A small missing moment, a gap in a timeline, a piece of evidence that arrives too late, or arrives damaged, or arrives in the wrong place. Cases like this do not stay unsolved because everyone is stupid. They stay unsolved because reality is a low-light environment. and humans are not built for perfect recall. So, while Cooper keeps hovering like a persistent ghost in the file room, you let yourself step sideways into a few other calm mysteries, the kind that do not shout but still manage to hold your sleeve. You start with a disappearance that feels like it was designed to irritate investigators. A man named Dan, again, because life loves repeating names, vanishes under ordinary circumstances, the way people do when the world swallows them without ceremony. You picture a car left in a place it shouldn't be, or a door left unlocked, or a routine that breaks once and then never repairs itself. In these cases, there is rarely a single dramatic moment. It is more like watching a clock stop and realizing nobody can agree on when it stopped. You follow the typical pattern. A missing person report gets made, sometimes late, because adults are allowed to be absent without immediate panic. Friends think, maybe he needed space. Family thinks, maybe she turned her phone off. Coworkers think, maybe he quit. And then days pass and the excuses rot. Searches happen, but they happen after weather, after traffic, after time has already walked over the scene. Witnesses give statements that start with confidence and end with uncertainty. I saw her Tuesday. No, wait, maybe Monday. He was wearing a jacket, or maybe a hoodie, or maybe I'm mixing him up with someone else. The human brain is not a recording device. It is a storyteller that edits without permission. And you, the detective, spend your nights trying to pin jelly to a wall. You move through another case, another kind of unresolved, the unidentified body. You find them in places people do not look unless they have to. A ditch, a patch of woods behind an industrial lot, a riverbank, again, because rivers do not just carry money, they carry endings. There is a specific smell to this work, a wrong sweetness that never quite leaves your clothes. There is a specific quiet, too. Even the loudest investigators get softer around the dead, because the dead do not argue, and you do not want to be the person arguing with them. In an unidentified case, the evidence is the body's own history: teeth, bones, clothing labels, old fractures that healed crooked, like punctuation in a life story. You take fingerprints, if the skin allows. You photograph tattoos, if they exist. You look at jewelry, if it wasn't stolen. You check missing persons databases, and you learn that databases are only as good as what people enter. If nobody reported them missing, they can remain nameless. If they were reported missing in one state and found in another, the match can be missed for years. And if they lived on the margins, the paperwork of their existence can be thin. That is the part that always makes you tired in a deeper way. Not just the mystery, the idea that someone can vanish so completely that even their name does not follow. So you drift into a case like that, something low-key and unresolved, not a famous headline, but a human being who became a question mark. Maybe it is a young person last seen walking home, a routine path that suddenly becomes legendary because it ends in nothing. Maybe it is an older person who steps out for groceries and never returns, leaving the kettle on, leaving mail in the box, leaving the world to decide what happened. The investigations are similar every time. Phone records, bank records, interviews that begin tender and end suspicious. Friends who know secrets. Neighbors who know nothing or claim they know nothing. A spouse who says the relationship was fine and you can hear the lie before you can prove it. And the worst part is how often the resolution, when it comes, is dull, a fall, an exposure death, a misadventure that became fatal because nobody found them in time. It is not always murder, but the not knowing is its own kind of violence. And then there are the cases that seem to echo Cooper, not in method, but in feeling. A person who disappears with intention, a calculated exit, a life folded up and put away. You picture someone leaving behind a wallet or taking just enough cash or buying a one-way ticket somewhere, not because they want fame, but because they want distance. The difference between a planned disappearance and a tragic one is sometimes only visible in hindsight. And hindsight is a cruel witness. As you drift through these other mysteries, you start noticing the common thread the outline promised you: missing moments, the gap between a person leaving work and the car found later, the gap between a last phone call and the silence after, the gap between an airplane jump and a riverbank discovery years later. Investigations live in those gaps, not in the loud parts, in the quiet, missing minutes nobody can reconstruct. And you start thinking, again, about all the ways leads arrive too late. A witness remembers a detail 5 years afterward, when it is already useless. A piece of evidence gets found by accident, handled by well-meaning hands, contaminated beyond clarity. A confession comes from a dying person who mixes truth with fantasy. A suspect dies, taking whatever they knew into the ground, whether they were guilty or just adjacent. Time is not neutral. Time is an accomplice. It softens the edges of everything until you cannot hold it. And somewhere in that softening, you feel yourself circling back to Cooper again. Because Cooper is the story that taught the public how to enjoy an unsolved case. It is the one they treat like a campfire tale. But you have been walking through the quieter ones, and now you see him in the same light, not as a folk hero, but as another human-shaped absence. The Bureau eventually stops active investigation, at least in the way people imagine. They shift resources. They triage again, because there are always new cases, fresh bodies, new missing people, new crimes that do not wait politely in line behind old mysteries. That is another reality check nobody loves. Justice has a schedule, and it is overcrowded. So Cooper becomes something like a long-term file, revisited when something new arrives, otherwise dormant. But dormant does not mean dead. It means waiting in the dark, like a phone that might ring again. And it does ring, sometimes. A new suspect, a new test method, a new piece of analysis on the money, a new book that claims certainty. You watch those waves come and go. You watch the public's attention swell, then recede. And you keep noticing the same obstacle, the one that is too simple to be dramatic. The key moment happened in darkness, night, weather, wilderness, 3 things that do not give receipts. So you go back to what you can still touch, even now, the behavior. You consider how Cooper handled people. He did not need to be cruel to control them. He used the social contract like a weapon. He spoke calmly, so others had to match his calm. He made specific demands, so others could not pretend to misunderstand. He stayed polite, so the crew could not justify rash heroics without feeling foolish. This is not charisma. It is something colder. It is a person who understands that most adults or trained to comply with authority. Even when the authority is fake, he borrowed authority from the mere idea of a bomb. He borrowed authority from the narrowness of an airplane cabin. He borrowed authority from the crew's responsibility for passenger safety. And when the passengers were gone, he borrowed authority from the crew's responsibility for themselves. That is a kind of intelligence, yes. But it is also a kind of emptiness. Because to do that, you have to be able to sit with other people's fear without flinching. You have to be able to watch a flight attendant's hands shake and still ask for another bourbon. Some people call that cool. You call it practiced. Then you consider the most annoying possibility of all, that this was not his first crime, just his most famous one. You look for similar hijackings, similar demands, similar flight profiles. There were copycats, of course. The early 1970s had a string of hijackings because airport security was softer and the concept had proven itself. But none of them match Cooper's particular blend of restraint and vanishing. Most hijackers want to land somewhere. They want political asylum. They want publicity. They want to rant. Cooper wanted to leave the plane. He wanted to go into the dark. That is a different motive. Not ideology, not escape to another country, despite the Mexico City talk. A disappearance. And disappearance is always a personal motive, even when it looks like money, which brings you again to the money that did not move. $200,000 in 1971 is worth much more in today's terms. It is life-changing, but it is not infinite. It is not a private island. It is a new identity if you are careful, a fresh start if you are lucky. It is also a curse because it is marked. So you imagine him afterward if he lived, not spending it like a winner, but living with it like a secret infection, a little at a time maybe, in ways that do not attract attention, or not at all, because you cannot deposit it. You cannot use it for a car. You cannot pay a mortgage with it without someone asking questions. So maybe he used it in the only safe way, small cash purchases spread over years, blended into the noise. And if he did that well enough, you would never see it. The absence of serial number hits stops being proof of death and becomes proof of caution. But then you remember Tina Barr, those bundles in the sand, and caution starts to wobble. Because if he was careful, why lose bundles? Unless he did not lose them. Unless they were placed. Unless the river did the placing. Unless the bundles were never in his hands after the jump, because he never stood up again. You see how the mind looks. That is what unresolved cases do. They turn your thoughts into a carousel, and the music is always slightly out of tune. You also sit with the possibility that Cooper had help. An accomplice on the ground. A planned pickup. A car parked on a logging road, engine idling, heater running. That would solve a lot. It would make the jump survivable and the escape plausible. It would also introduce more risk because accomplices are liabilities. They talk. They get greedy. They get arrested for unrelated things and trade secrets for lighter sentences. They break up with partners and confess out of spite. They do the one thing you do not want in a clean plan. They become human. Yet no accomplice ever clearly emerges. No one gets caught with marked money and a story that holds. No one provides inside details that can be verified beyond what was public. So if there was help, It stayed quiet for decades, and that kind of long silence is rare. Not impossible, just rare. Which leaves you where you always end up, in this case, balancing probabilities like a tired accountant. Could he have survived? Yes. Could he have lost the money? Yes. Could the money have traveled by river? Yes. Could it have been buried by someone else? Yes. And the truth might be one of these, or a messy combination that nobody likes. Because people like a single ending. The world, unfortunately, prefers multiple choice. You let your mind return to the cabin, because sometimes the best way to understand an ending is to watch the beginning again. You are Tina Mucklow for a moment, standing near the cockpit, listening to the aircraft hum, smelling cigarette smoke soaked into upholstery. You are aware, in a quiet animal way, that something is happening behind you that you are not allowed to see. You imagine the rear stairs light flickering. You imagine the pressure change. You imagine the sound, that low roar, like an open mouth in the back of the plane. And you imagine Cooper in that moment. Not legendary, just a man alone with his decision. He checks straps. He secures the money. He tests the stairwell with a foot, feeling vibration through the soles of his loafers. He looks into blackness and sees nothing. And he steps anyway. That step is the only clean act in the whole thing. After that, it is all chaos and chance. And because it is chaos and chance, the case becomes immortal. If he had landed in a field and been seen, it would be a footnote. If he had broken his leg and crawled to a road, it would be a police report and a mugshot. If he had died and been found quickly, it would be a tragedy and a closed file. But he stepped into the one environment that is perfectly designed to erase outcomes. Night, rain, trees. So now, decades later, you sit with the real reason the case stays alive. It feels tidy, man hijacks plane, gets money, jumps, vanishes. A clean arc, a story with the seductive promise that maybe, just maybe, someone outsmarted the system. And people love that promise because it lets them imagine the system is a game. But you know the system is not a game. The system is forms and budgets and tired agents with coffee breath and evidence lockers that smell like dust and old plastic. The system is someone misfiling a report and nobody noticing for months. The system is a witness moving away and changing their phone number. The system is a sheriff in a small county doing their best with limited resources. So when the public asks, why is it unsolved? You want to answer with something boring and honest. Because the moment that mattered happened where nobody could see. Because the evidence that remained was thin. Because thin evidence bends easily into many shapes. Because every suspect eventually hits one stubborn missing fact. And because reality rarely wraps itself neatly. You are not done with the story, not even close, because this case does not end. It just changes texture. It becomes less about chasing a man through woods and more about watching the investigation itself age, watching methods improve, watching theories calcify, watching certainty get sold and resold like merchandise. You watch the tie get reanalyzed. You watch the flight path modeling get refined. You watch people argue about whether the found money was upstream contamination or downstream deposition. You watch the Bureau eventually announce in the modern era that active investigation is suspended, not because they solved it, but because time has eaten most of what time can eat. And the case remains, not as a roar, but as a hum, a soft, electrical sound behind the walls of American true crime culture. And that hum is not just about Cooper. It is about the uncomfortable fact that sometimes the dark simply keeps what it is given, not because it is clever, but because it is big. So you keep the file open in your mind and you keep looking at the small human choices, because those are the only lights you get. Why a short flight? Why that plane? Why that calm voice? Why 4 parachutes? Why a bomb that was never recovered? Why no proven spending? Why 3 bundles of money, years later, like a throat clearing from the past? And you sit with the least cinematic possibility of all, that Cooper is not one perfect story. He is a handful of ordinary explanations stacked on top of each other until they look like magic. A security era that allowed anonymity, a plane designed with a rear stare, a weather system that hid everything, a wilderness that does not return what it takes, an investigation fighting physics with paperwork, a public that keeps breathing life into the question. You let that thought settle, not as a conclusion, but as a frame. Because frames are what you build when you cannot build a door. And once you have that frame, you find yourself turning back again to the one thing that still feels like a physical whisper. Those bills on the riverbank stuck together like they had been waiting patiently for a child's hands to dig them up. You think about what else might still be out there, in mud, in silt, in the root tangle of old trees. A strap buckle, a fragment of canopy, a bundle of 20s pressed flat under sand, or nothing at all. And that is the maddening calm of it. You can search forever, and the answer might still be silence. So you keep moving through the case the only way you can, one unglamorous detail at a time, letting the mystery stay a mystery while you study the shape of how it refuses to end. So you begin asking the only question that matters in any old file room. What would it take to truly close it? Not a theory, not a favorite suspect, not a neat little ending you can fold up. You need something that survives cross-examination. A parachute harness with a serial tag that leads to a purchase. A fingerprint that matches a living person, or a dead one with records. A confession that includes details the newspapers never printed. And with Cooper, you keep running into the same sleepy wall. The evidence is either too small, or too late, or too weathered. A tie that sat for decades, gathering meaning like dust. A few bundles of bills that might have traveled, or might have been placed. A jump point estimated from a bump in a cockpit during rain and cloud. You think people hate this case because it is unsolved. That is not quite it. People hate it because it refuses to behave like a lesson. Most crimes teach you something simple in the end. Do not trust him. Do not go there. Do not open that door. Do not get in that car. This one teaches you something less comforting. Sometimes distance wins. Sometimes a few miles of forest and an hour of darkness are enough. Not because the criminal is a wizard, because the world is messy and the world is big. You return one last time to the money on that sandbar, because it is the closest thing you have to a voice. You picture the Columbia River moving slow and heavy, carrying silt like memory. You picture seasonal floods, the way they rearrange shorelines without asking. A winter surge can bury things deep, then later uncover them. like the river is changing its mind. If the bundles were in the water, they could have snagged in debris. A logjam can trap objects like a lazy net. Then, the logjam breaks apart, and what was trapped gets released downstream. Grouped bills can stay grouped if they are stuck in mud together long enough. But that is the maddening part. Nature can mimic intention. A human can bury money, and a river can bury money, and both leave the same result, and you are left staring at damp paper, trying to decide if it is a message or an accident. The tie analysis feels the same way. Those tiny particles, the trace metals in the fabric, interesting, but not obedient. They point toward industries, not individuals. Aerospace work, metal fabrication, maybe even rail or chemical manufacturing. In the Pacific Northwest of that era, that is not a narrow list. So you do what tired investigators always do. You start thinking about what is missing instead of what is present. No verified bills spent, no parachute found, no body recovered, no clean witness to the jump itself, no confirmed sighting afterward that holds up under daylight scrutiny. And you realize the case might be unsolved for the most boring reason of all. It might be unsolved because nothing else is left to find. Not because the Bureau did not try, not because the public did not crowd the story with theories, because rain and time took the rest, or because the man lived and did the most difficult thing a criminal can do. He stayed quiet. He did not brag. He did not confess. He did not turn it into a performance. He treated the crime the way you treat a bad decision at 3 a.m. You do it, you regret it, and you never bring it up again. That idea is not romantic, but it is human. People imagine a clever outlaw laughing at the system, but if you have worked enough cases, you know the more common picture. A person who goes back to being average, because average is camouflage. A person who watches the news with a blank face and feels nothing you can prove. And there is another angle you cannot ignore, even if it is uncomfortable. The hijacking happened in an era where procedures were softer. A one-way ticket bought with cash, a name written on a slip, and that was enough. A passenger could smoke, could drink, could sit with a briefcase nobody searched. After Cooper, that world starts hardening. Airlines add rules. Security changes, slowly at first, then faster as years pass. Not because Cooper was the only reason. He was just one more push, a reminder that a polite man in a tie can still rearrange your entire night. So, the case leaves behind an impact even without a name. It changes the way people look at airports. It changes the way agencies share information. It becomes a cautionary tale told in memos and training rooms, not just television. And still, the man himself stays out of reach, which means the ending you get is not an answer. It is a shape. The shape is this: a controlled hijacking with minimal violence. A demand built around psychology, not brute force. A jump into conditions that are either reckless or desperate, or simply misjudged. Then, a silence so complete it becomes the loudest part of the story. You sit with that shape and you understand why every perfect suspect fails. Because you cannot force a person into a story and call it evidence. You cannot solve a case by wanting it solved. You need the stubborn little item that refuses to be anything else. And Cooper did not leave many stubborn items. He left a tie and some paper and a memory of a calm voice. He left a set of procedures for everyone else to follow long after he was gone. So what does justice look like here? In the end, it looks like an evidence locker that stays labeled. It looks like a file that gets reopened whenever technology improves. It looks like agents who roll their eyes at the legend, but still run the test. Not because they believe in fairy tales, because they believe in due diligence. You do not get a courtroom, you do not get a sentencing. You get the steady, bureaucratic refusal to pretend an unknown man is a myth, even if the public treats him like one. And now, as you let the case settle back onto its shelf, you notice what it shares with all the other quiet mysteries. A missing moment that never got filled in. A few objects that survived without enough context to speak clearly. A world that kept turning while the unanswered question stayed behind. You can live your whole life without meeting a mystery like this. Most crimes are solved by something embarrassingly ordinary. A careless phone call, a jealous friend, a license plate caught on a camera, a wallet left at the wrong place at the wrong time. But this one is built from weather, distance, and restraint. It is built from a short flight, a polite note, and a rear stairwell open tonight. It is built from the simple truth that wilderness does not file reports. So you close the folder gently, like you are trying not to wake anyone. The paper inside is tired, and so are you. And the last thing you are left with is not a punchline or a twist. It is a low, ongoing hum, an old question in a dark sky. Some nights, the dark simply keeps what it is given, and somewhere